Okay, my name is Gianpaolo Gazzarelli. I'm with WITS and Sapienza in Rome. WITS here. And I'm chairing the next session with three very distinguished presenters, Alain, Marciano, my colleague and friend and co-author, who's going to be talking about the political economy of Buchanan's Samaritan dilemma. Very interesting. Alain has an interest in law and economics, public choice, history of Islamic thought, and institutional economics. Then we have Bill Tulloh, and I'm going to say more about him later, and Professor Andreas Freytag. Thank you. Alain, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, Michael, Isabella, and also for giving me the opportunity to be there. Nice place and with these very interesting persons. We have been a very interesting day yesterday, and I look forward to this day today. And also, I want to thank Gianpaolo because he introduced me to, gave me the opportunity to read Carl Mittermeier's book when was it, 2 years ago, something like that. And when he asked me to review the book. And I found that very, very extremely interesting because it exactly corresponds to the way I see the history of, let's say, liberalism. And on the one hand, the people who believe that the market can work without rules. On the other hand, the people who believe that we need rules of the game. And on the side of the people who believe that it's not okay. I uploaded the wrong presentation. It's all right.
We can fix this.
No, it's all right. It's not a problem. There are only a few changes that I made. Not necessarily marginal, but so if there are typos or things like that, I apologize in advance. Yes, so on the side of the economists and thinkers who believe that we need rules of the game, there is the old Chicago economists, Frank Knight, Henry Simons, and Virginia political economist James Buchanan, who was a student of Knight and who was very much influenced by Simons. And Carl Mittermeier talks about Buchanan, and I was very interested in what he said, because there is a lot of proximity between Mittermeier and Buchanan, and for me. And you have to remember, so as an historian, I was struck by that. You have to remember that the book was written the first book, which is his second dissertation. Right, so the book was written in '86. At that time, it was entirely new. No one really saw the history or the distinction between the libertarians and the others in the way he did. So it was really new, really innovative at that time. We may not have this impression today because it's late, because now it's more common sense. But at that time it was really innovative. So this is why also this book is very important. Anyway, so I want to focus on Buchanan and the importance that rules are for Buchanan, and the importance of ethical, as it's written in the title, which does not correspond to the title that is on the program, but it's exactly the same topic, just a title that changes. Ethical and constitutional rules. So Buchanan argued that rules are necessary, rules of the game. And ethical rules are part of the rules of the game, and or to a certain extent, ethical rules are constitutional rules. And so ethical rules are personal constitutional rules, and constitutional rules in the standard sense of the word. This is not entirely new, even for the people who don't know very well Buchanan's work, but I think that I'm giving some new insights based on the paper, an essay that Buchanan published in 1975, and that is entitled The Samaritan's Dilemma. So I'm going to talk about the Samaritan's dilemma and start from what Buchanan said on cooperation, market failures, because Buchanan believed that markets were not totally efficient all the time, that markets could fail. But he also believed that it's not because markets fail that we need to rely on government and state intervention. So this is more or less what I'm going to talk about. This one of the main point, one of my main convictions about Buchanan is that Buchanan always trusted individuals, in the sense that Buchanan always trusted the individual's willingness to cooperate. It doesn't start from the idea, so his very first papers, 1949, 1951, and then 1952, show that. And even his dissertation that was defended in 1949, so don't forget that I'm mainly an historian of economic thought, so that explains the many references to history. It's a bias, I can do it differently. And in the very beginning of his career, Buchanan believed that people were going to, all the individuals were going to pay their taxes, cooperate, pay for the public goods they consume, pay for the externalities that their behavior create, pay for the social cost their actions behave. So for Buchanan, he believed in cooperation. And this is something that he made clear in 1964 in What Should Economists Do? The task of economists, of the economists, is to study cooperative trading arrangements. So he believed in cooperation rather than in conflict. But he also believed that markets could fail. So there is no contradiction in that. We are going to see why. And one of the consequences of the fact that Buchanan believed in cooperation is that he did not really believe in free riding. So one could say, if you look at the history of the evolution of his thought, you can see that he started to talk about free riding at the end of the 1950s and the early 60s, and he was not so much convinced that free riding could be a problem that individuals could free ride. So when he read Samuelson in 1954, he was surprised, shocked by what Samuelson was writing for various reasons, but one of them was that Samuelson explained in the famous 1954 article that individuals, that we cannot have an optimal allocation of resources when there are public goods, because why? Because individuals are self-interested, and because self-interested individuals free ride whenever they can. So this is the conclusion of Samuelson's article. And Buchanan was shocked by that. It went against all that he believed at that time. And it took him for some time to accept that individuals could indeed free ride, that Samuelson was not really wrong, at least not wrong all the time. And you have to keep in mind that Buchanan completely disagreed with Samuelson, and the reverse is true. Samuelson completely disagreed with Buchanan from the very beginning of their relationship. So in 1955, Buchanan started to write Samuelson because he had read his 1954 article. He disagreed with Samuelson, but he wanted to write Samuelson to show him why he disagreed with Samuelson. So they exchanged a lot of letters, but eventually Samuelson was bored by the discussion, so he stopped answering Buchanan. And Buchanan went on writing Samuelson, trying to show Samuelson that they were both right, that Samuelson was right, because you remember that Samuelson was really a star in the 1950s, already a star in the 1950s. So Buchanan didn't want to disagree with Samuelson. He wanted to agree with Samuelson, but Samuelson didn't really care. So Buchanan went on with this idea that, okay, Samuelson could be right, but I am right too. So how could I reconcile these two views? This is more or less what the paper is about, to a certain extent. So, and you see that in 1964 there is this idea that he talks of the specter of the free rider found in the literature of modern public finance theory. And so 1964, and he still found that what Samuelson has said about free riding and Musgrave also, and Thibault also, because Buchanan also disagreed with Thibault, about free riding was not entirely true. So yes, there is this vague idea that individuals could free ride. But if you go on reading the 1964 article, it says that individuals could free ride, but at the same time, they always find solutions to go beyond this problem. So even when there is a problem of free riding, individuals can find solutions to these kind of problems. So the question is, when do individuals cooperate? So I think I'm too long. So when do individuals cooperate? So basically there are two major points that you have to keep in mind to understand the rest of the presentation. He compares two kind of behaviors, the moral behavior and the expediency criterion. So moral behavior is a kind of following or being moral, behaving morally means following a Kantian rule of action. To avoid any kind of a question about Kant, it's a very superficial reading of Kant. I'm not even sure that Buchanan had read Kant at that time. So, but it's a Kantian rule of action in the sense that individuals behave as they want others to behave. So they do to others what they want others do to them. And private, so it's a kind of non-narrow or large self-interest. It's self-interest, but not really narrow. And then there is the private maxim, which is narrow self-interest. Individuals do what they want to do, they don't take care of other people. So we have these two kind of behaviors. Not really preferences, but only behaviors, moral or non-moral, self-interested or moral. And then there are two kind of environments. When do individuals behave morally? When do individuals behave self-interested in a narrow sense of the word? It depends on the size of groups in which individuals are. In small groups versus large groups. So these dates from 1964. About the same time, Olson wrote his book. So Monsieur Olson wrote his book, Buchanan wrote his article on club and size of groups, but they ignored that they were writing on the same topic. So they met after they had written their work. So it's a matter of size. In small groups, individuals behave morally. Why? Because they know that their action is going to influence what others do, and because they know that they are going to influence what others do, they behave morally because they want to lead others to behave morally. So to a certain extent, it means that individuals cooperate because they want to lead others to cooperate. In large group is different because in large groups individuals know that they won't be able to influence what others do, so they are going to be narrowly self-interested. So he wrote something which was published later in a book, 67 or 68 I think, but the first draft that is in the archive is earlier than that, 64, 65. It's called a probability theory of free riding. So he admits free riding, but free riding depends on the probability to to meet someone who is going to free ride. So to use words that could find an echo in evolutionary theory, or evolutionary game theory. So individuals cooperate in small groups, and sorry, this should not be there. So does this idea rule out free riding? Yes and no. So in small groups, individuals cooperate, but we also need rules to exclude potential free riders, because we can always have free riders in small groups for various reasons. So we need property rights to exclude free riders to potential free riders. This is what he writes in the economic theory of clubs. So, and in the end, he says that in small groups, individuals behave morally, so ethics is important, ethical rules are important, but then property rights, so legal rules are also important, and so ethics and the law combine to guarantee cooperation in small groups. In large groups, it's to a certain extent easier, because in large groups it happens. So in large groups it happens, as Samuelson has said, and Musgrave and Chegu and many others. Yes, so you see that Buchanan eventually, but only partially, agreed with Samuelson. In large groups, Samuelson is right. But where he's wrong is that there are many situations in which the large group model does not apply. So, how many time do I have? Okay.
I will remind you.
So we have 4 types of situations. So you see the first typo. So the first sentence is not correct. Sorry, apologies for that. So there are four possible situations. First, we are in a small group. So individuals are in a small group. We have moral individuals in a small group. Therefore, this guarantees cooperation. No free riding. We need property rights, as I said, but it's a club. It's a club situation, and in this club, individuals cooperate. There is no need to coerce them, to force them to cooperate. Then there is a second situation when non-moral individuals are in large groups, non-moral, narrowly self-interested individuals in large groups. Then it's rather simple also. Here we need Samuelson, who said government intervention. Buchanan could agree with that. At least we need a social contract. We need strong rules to force individuals to cooperate. So in large groups, there is what Buchanan called the large group ethical dilemma, which is comparable to a prisoner's dilemma, but on a larger scale. So, which is surprising is that Buchanan stops there. So, in the 1965 article, Buchanan stops there. In the sense that there are only 2 situations. Small groups, it works. Large groups, it doesn't work. Actually, there are also 2 other situations. When we have moral individuals in a large group or non-moral individuals in a small group. And Buchanan does not really analyze these situations, at least until so they are implicit in his work. They become explicit precisely in the Samaritan dilemma. So the question is, what is the outcome, what is the nature of the interaction between individuals who are not in the right, who do not behave according to the environment in which they are. If we have non-moral individuals in small groups, non-moral individuals in small groups. There is individuals who are narrowly self-interested. These individuals always behave in the same way. They do not cooperate. They ignore others. They ignore that their action is dependent from what the others do, or they ignore that their actions have consequences on others. They know that there are interdependencies, but they ignore that. So they do not cooperate. They could cooperate, this is what is mentioned here, they could cooperate if they recognize that there are interdependencies. But as long as they do not recognize these interdependencies, they do not cooperate. So my point is that there is always a moment, a period of time in which these narrowly self-interested individuals who enter a small group do not realize that the others are cooperators and behave as non-cooperators. They defect. So to talk in terms of game theory. They defect, and on the other hand, the moral individuals cooperate because they have a dominant strategy, which is to cooperate. So the equilibrium of this interaction between a non-moral individual who enters a small group and a moral individual who is in a small group is an asymmetric equilibrium in which the moral individual cooperates and the non-moral individual does not cooperate. Then there is the second type of situation when you have moral individuals in large groups. A moral individual in a large group behaves, the situation is similar, in the sense that the moral individual who enters a large group is a moral individual, so as long as he does not recognize that the others are not moral individuals, he is going to cooperate. But the others are narrow maximizers. They do not cooperate, therefore they defect. So we have exactly the same situation. The non-moral individuals defect, the moral individuals cooperate. The equilibrium is the asymmetric interaction, the asymmetric outcome in which one individual cooperates and the other does not cooperate. This equilibrium, so don't look too precisely into the matrices, I'm going to explain them. This is the situation. So Buchanan acknowledges the situation very early. So in historical terms, 1959, you can find a first instance of Buchanan acknowledging that this kind of situation is possible. And then there are other instances during the 60s in which he admits that this could happen. But immediately, as soon as he admits that, in the paper he wrote, as soon as he admits that, he also says that it's not going to last. So these situations are possible, but in his mind, at least until the early 70s, in his mind, these situations are unlikely. They cannot last. It's only in the 70s, early 70s, when he writes this article, this essay entitled The Samaritan's Dilemma. So the essay was published in 1975 in a collected volume edited by Edmund Phelps on altruism. And but the paper was written in 1970. And the paper has nothing to do with altruism. In particular, the Samaritan in the Samaritan's Dilemma is not an altruistic individual. Buchanan does not use the word. If you want to know exactly the the background. He wrote the paper because he wanted to describe the situation that was happening in the American academia. So he was at UCLA, the situation was particularly violent, he was affected by that, and the Samaritan's dilemma was written to express this idea that there are some people who pay their taxes and some people who benefit from the taxes that the taxpayers pay. Okay, so, and he told me that when he presented the paper in various seminars, the reactions were not very friendly. Because in the Samaritan's dilemma, he calls the Samaritan, and the recipient is the parasite. And so he started the presentations by saying that the taxpayers are the Samaritans, and the others who benefit from the taxes without doing any effort in return are the parasites. And of course, in the context, the parasites were the students. That was not well perceived. So, and this is removed from the published version of the paper, but it's exactly to what it corresponds. So there are two versions of the Samaritan's dilemma. The point here is not really, these are the matrices that are in Buchanan's essay. The active version and the passive version, so I'm not going to enter into the details, but let me check just something. Yes, this is another. So what you see that the active version on the left, the passive version on the right, but you see that in both cases, so the Samaritan is the A and the recipient is B. One is no cooperation for the Samaritan, 2 cooperation. B has 2 strategies to make some effort, 1, and to make no effort, 2. So the idea is that the Samaritan gives some money to the recipient, to the parasite, and the recipient has 2 strategies. Either he works, makes some efforts, or he makes no efforts. So the equilibrium, the point of Buchanan is the equilibrium of this game is precisely the one I mentioned between the moral individuals and large groups and the non-moral individuals in small groups. The equilibrium is here, in both cases. So the equilibrium is the situation in which the Samaritan cooperates and the recipient makes no effort in return. So he takes the money and that's it. So the Samaritan does an effort to help the recipient, the recipient makes no effort in return. And this is the equilibrium that we reach when we have an interaction between between non-moral individuals and moral individuals. Oops, sorry. So, and the thing is that, how do we escape this situation? So the Samaritan's dilemma is a very negative, very pessimistic essay. It's very easy to infer bad consequences about Buchanan from when you read this article. But the thing, I'm going to stop here on this slide. The thing is that if you want to escape, you cannot escape from this dilemma once you are trapped in the dilemma. The only solution is to avoid dilemma in advance. If you have not rules, ethical rules or constitutional rules, that allow you to not to enter the dilemma, then you are trapped. And if you are trapped, it's over. The equilibrium is the bad one. Cooperation, non-cooperation. And if you want to avoid the dilemma, you have to have either ethical rules. So ethical rules in that sense does not mean that the recipient must have an ethical rule to effort. The ethical rules that to which Buchanan referred is the rule that leads the Samaritan to not being too kind. The Samaritan must avoid excessive kindness. So the Samaritan must be able to understand that if he helps the parasite, the recipient, he is going to be trapped in a dilemma. So he must avoid helping people to avoid the dilemma. And if it's not possible, if the Samaritans are not able to avoid this kindness, then we need constitutional rules. And I want to insist on that, and we'll finish that. You see that to Buchanan, the first type of rule that is important is the ethical rule. If we have ethical rules, then we will have cooperation, and we will avoid the traps of non-cooperation, or at least asymmetric non-cooperation. And then it's only when, and we go back to the 64 article on what should economists do. If we have ethical rules, then we don't need constitutional rules. We don't even need a social contract. It's only when ethics is insufficient that we need a social contract. That's it. Thank you.
So we started a few minutes late, so we have 10 minutes for questions. From the floor, Andreas? Yeah.
I have one question. The term Samaritan's dilemma is also used in development economics a lot. Did Buchanan ever refer to that in his later work?
No, actually, I think that he was the first to use the term. So the question should be put in the reverse.
No, I was whether he acknowledged that.
No.
It is also broader. I think it's much broader in the development context than it is here. So I thought whether he would reflect on the use of his term.
No, he didn't do that. And the reverse is that most of the literature on the Samaritan's dilemma does not refer to Buchanan.
That's clear.
So, well, actually, the Samaritan's dilemma is an incentive problem. It's a problem of moral hazard.
Yeah.
But
Niels?
I just have a question to the last line of your last slide. So you mentioned there are no pragmatism. So, but you don't mention it if I hear it right. So why do you would argue that there's no pragmatism? So you would say there is no escape from having then a constitutional rule? Or?
so yes, what I meant is that there is no pragmatism in the sense that once you have entered the interaction, and you cannot fix the problem by using pragmatic solutions to once you are in the dilemma. Once you are in the dilemma, you are trapped and it's finished. You cannot solve it afterwards. This is in that sense that I mean no pragmatism. You have to have constitutional or ethical rules in advance to avoid the trap or the problem to arrive. If the problem is there, you cannot solve it pragmatically. This is what I meant. Maybe the terms are not correct, but this is what I meant.
So do you mean like with exchange, with trade, or
No, I mean with
bargaining?
No, I don't really see no pragmatic solution to in the sense that you cannot you cannot propose a solution when you are in the dilemma. When you have a Samaritan and a recipient, if there is no rule that prevents the Samaritan to be a Samaritan or prevent the recipient to behave as a parasite, you cannot find a solution to the dilemma.
Alain?
Yeah, well, let's go back just for a second to Hume. Remember Hume said, should I help my neighbor gather the harvest or not? And he said that I will not do so because I can't count on my neighbor to help me when my harvest comes, right? So that seems to me to come to, Hume never thought, I didn't think of this as being moral or not moral. You know, I think he just thought this was somebody making a calculation about his adversary. And the other thing is, Buchanan's always been a problem because he operates in a world where underlying there's this theoretical debate going on at a different level. And you've got, on the one hand, general equilibrium people who assume that I have no impact on you because of the large number. And on the other hand, you've got game theorists who have spent all their time worrying about the interactions. And Buchanan seems to sort of borrow from one and borrow from the other. I find it strange that he attributes this to different sorts of morality. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
The game theorists are somehow involved with morality, and the other guys are not, just because there's an infinite number of consumers. And and your last remark about this will not last. You said, you know, this will not last. But that introduces a dimension which is not in any of the model. I mean, he has a static little model which he looks at, and then he says, well, this won't last. But you know, there's no time consideration in there. These people don't have long-term utility.
Well,
Three questions.
three questions.
Yeah.
Actually, this is my way of presenting it. There is a time dimension in the Samaritan dilemma, in the sense that Buchanan tries to, when he is there with these games, he says, so he tries to see the game in a dynamic perspective. So this is a description of a situation. He says, okay, we are in the fourth cell, we are there, but the two players want to be there. So he describes a kind of dynamic process that could lead the players to this situation. The Samaritan could change his behavior, and the parasite or the recipient would change his behavior, adapting his behavior to the changing behavior of the Samaritan, who then change his behavior in return, and they could end up in this situation. He says the point is that it's not going to happen. So there is a dynamic dimension.
That's a dynamic discussion of a transformation of one of these matrices into another one.
Yes.
And that's sort of, I don't find that he has any sort of real theoretical justification for that. It's a discussion. But anyway, maybe I shouldn't take
you're right on that. And just a minor point about the moral dimension in you. It's a calculation here. So he says moral behavior, non-moral behavior, but it's a calculation. The moral individual calculates the probability of meeting someone who is going to help. So it's rational in the certain sense. It's in the Hume's terms that you were referring to, the Samaritan or the moral individual cooperates because he anticipates that the other is going to cooperate, otherwise he wouldn't cooperate. So it's very close to what Hume said.
Yeah, okay. I think that's right.
So it was Aldo, then you, and then we can continue during tea break. Aldo?
Yes, so it's about the dynamics story and the conclusion that they will not, eventually get to where they want to be. I think that also depends on initial conditions. For example, the proportion of morals to non-morals. Because of this interaction, then will change the attitude of the other side.
Yes and no. No, in the sense that Buchanan said so. But the moral individual is moral. In a small group, the moral individual knows that his behavior is going to affect the behavior of others, therefore he is behaving morally. The non-moral individual is non-moral. Even if he's among saints, he said, even if the proportion of cooperators is high, the non-moral individual is a non-moral individual. He behaves. So in that sense, he is not a game theorist. So he's not a game theorist, is that he doesn't use this evolutionary game theory, the probability to meet someone who is going to cooperate and so on, is not that precise. So, as you said, he has not a theoretical model of that. So I did that. So, with modesty, I tried to do that. I tried to model the origin of the dilemma, because he doesn't even explain the origin of the dilemma. He says there is a dilemma, here it is. Why there is a dilemma, the link with altruism and the evolution in terms of dynamic terms, he doesn't explain that, because it's not his problem. His problem is to point at that and say, okay, we have a problem. There are parasites.
You, last question, yeah.
Thanks. I think my question is kind of, in a way, similar to what Alain has raised. And I think between almost the dichotomy of Samaritan and parasite, or moral and immoral, maybe there's kind of the middle ground of probably that's a majority of the people who have a calculated interest and a calculated decision. And I'm thinking, especially, I mean, within a small group, and that's linked to a possible almost answer to why people behave differently in the small group and bigger group, is that the information flow or the amount of information one can receive is different. In a small group, we know each other, we know what they did, and in the next round, then, I mean, if I do it badly, next round there will be retaliations. But in a group, I mean, it's very, very hard to track that information. So maybe it's a calculated risk or calculated behavior based on that how we see information is going to impact on our next round of, how we are received.
That's exactly what I said.
But then
I
it's
apologize, maybe.
not the two kind of as, I mean, I think it's the middle, majority of people maybe behaving in the middle.
That's what Buchanan said, and I think so. Maybe though I failed in my presentation because that's what Buchanan said and what I tried to convey. The moral individual is someone who lives in a world or in a group in which he knows that his action is going to have an influence on others, because there are very few individuals around. So they know what they do, what he does, and he knows what they do. So he knows what they do, And therefore, there is now we say there are reputation, effect, ostracism, and all that. He doesn't use these words, but it's exactly what he says. So, and in a large group, this does not happen, because in a large group, we don't have any influence on others, and others that do not influence what we do. So we behave as individuals. We treat others as part of nature, he says. In a small group, we behave strategically. In a large group, we behave non-strategically. I think that is, I don't see the difference between what you say and what I'm saying on behalf of Buchanan.
It's kind of similar, but I think the information is possibly a mediator factor between the individual and influence from what you're saying.
Thank you, but we're going to continue at tea time. Thank you, Alain. Thank you, everybody. The next speaker is Bill Tulloh. He's also my co-author, by the way. Only Andreas. So we have to fix that. We have to fix that. And Bill is he's affiliated also with George Mason, but I don't know if you like part-time researcher or freelance researcher. And his main business is actually in software and blockchain. And he's going to be talking about an abstract order of abstract relations. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me clarify. The program says I'm affiliated with George Mason, but that's neither an ex-ante or an ex-post fact, but an expired fact. A long time ago, I was a graduate student at George Mason University, and over the years I've had a number of affiliations with them, but I don't currently. As Giampi said, I have a company. I'm a co-founder and economist of a blockchain startup company in Silicon Valley called Agoric. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about that today. I wanted to talk about something more concrete. So as you can see, the title of my talk is An Abstract Order of Abstract Relations. So it's Hayek and Lachmann on the market order. Unlike some people here, I actually first came across Carl Mittermeier when I was a brand new graduate student, in a delightful article he wrote for the Lachmann Festschrift called Mechanomorphism. And I think in here we see the what we've now come to expect from Carl, both the his wit and his philosophical depth in this little paper. And his wit, of course, comes with his coining the term mechanomorphism as sort of the counterpart to anthropomorphism. But rather than just sort of taking the easy way out and sort of banging on the sort of mechanical view of economics or social sciences, he then goes into a deep discussion of metaphorical reasoning and so on. I encourage, it's not really talking about my paper, but I encourage you to read this paper. It's a short paper, but very delightful. I would also, I don't want to fail to mention my thanks to Isabella and Michael for inviting me here for this wonderful conference. It's been truly a delight so far. So what I'm going to do today, or try to do anyway, is sort of take you on a tour, kind of this, like Alain, a historical tour, but I really only want to make one very small point. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground to make just one very small point and hope that that point can come through at least partly. So I'm going to start with Freytag Hayek, who in 1937 wrote his famous paper, Economics and Knowledge. And there Hayek redefined the economic problem as intertemporal plan coordination where knowledge is dispersed and divided among the individuals. And he says in there, for equilibrium, separate plans must be based on the correct foresight of the actions of others, as well as correct foresight of external circumstances. Now this is a fairly high bar he sets for equilibrium. And we see that over the time, he realizes that, that correct expectations is, not really possible. So we see Hayek in 1973, in his first volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, replaces equilibrium with this concept of abstract order. And instead of correct expectations, he now talks about maximal certainty of expectations, expectations that have a good chance of being correct. And then he talks about rather than sort of perfect foresight, we now talk about adaptation to unforeseen events. And that recognizing that someone's expectations will be disappointed. So we see sort of this transition from Hayek 37 to Hayek 1973, where he goes from equilibrium to abstract order, from the mutual compatibility of plans to the maximal coincidence of expectations, from correct foresight to the adaptation of the unknown. So what's an abstract order? Now he covers this in the book, many pages, as well as elsewhere, but I want to narrow to just one specific aspect of this. He talks about an abstract order of abstract relations. So spontaneous orders need not be what we have called abstract, but they will often consist of a system of abstract relations between elements, which are also defined only by abstract properties. All that is necessary to preserve such an abstract order is that a certain structure of relationships need to be maintained. What can remain constant in such an overall order which continually adjusts itself to external changes and provides a basis of predictions can only be a system of abstract relationships and not its particular events. So that leads me to ask the question, so what are abstract relationships? And at least for me, Hayek doesn't provide an answer, or at least I can't find one. But my contention is that Lachmann does, or at least provides the start of one. So Lachmann, as probably most of you know, was a German economist. He did his doctorate with Werner Sombart in Berlin in 1930. In 1933, when Hitler took power, he left for London and became a student of Hayek at LSE. And then in 1949, he moved to Johannesburg, where he was professor at the University of Witwatersrand until his retirement. Well, one thing, I should mention that this is sort of a part of an overall project I've been working on, which is sort of an intellectual biography of Ludwig Lachmann. And I think in one thing, when you look at Lachmann's work, he's really developing the ideas that Hayek espoused in his 1937 paper, Economics and Knowledge. So in a letter from Lachmann to Hayek in 1955, shortly after he finished working on his book on capital theory, Lachmann writes to Hayek, now that the theory of capital is off my chest, I shall have to look for something else to occupy my mind. I am playing with the idea of writing something about the nature of social processes as vehicles of the transmission of knowledge, extending this idea of yours from economics to society in general, showing that this is what keeps the world moving. So, the result of this, I think, is the book he published in 1970, The Legacy of Max Weber. One of the things in this book, he presents a dynamic theory of institutions, and he shows how institutions help coordinate plans. But if institutions are going to be able to coordinate plans, then they have to sort of balance coherence and flexibility. They need to have stability so plans can coordinate, but they need to adapt as things change. So he has a framework where he talks about relatively immutable fundamental institutions, frequently mutable secondary institutions, and widening of existing institutions. Now, I think this is a fascinating original work on institutions, and I encourage people to look at it. I don't have time to get into it now, but for those who want to dig more, I think this is a nice overview paper, and I think this is at least worth at least 5 more minutes in my talk allocation here.
Thanks for the plug.
But I want to focus on a very narrow aspect of this, and it's in this quote in Legacy of Max Weber. He says, whether we post a letter, wait for a train, or draw a check, our action in each case is oriented towards a complex network of human action of which we know enough to make it serve our ends, though we may know next to nothing about the internal working order of these institutions. We know, of course, that such an internal working order exists, but in our everyday life we take no interest whatsoever in its details. Now I realize for some of the younger members of the audience this is a little bit confusing, so I wanted to change it a little bit. So whether we send an email, wait for an Uber, or pay with Bitcoin. So Lachmann describes institutions variously as nodal points of society, coordinating the actions of millions whom they relieve the need to acquire and digest detailed knowledge about others and form detailed expectations about their future action, or orientation schemes of the second order to which planners orient their plans as actors orient their actions to a plans, or in a lighter work, hinges. One is tempted to think of the institutional order as an array of hinges. The institutions within each hinge can move a great deal, if within limits, but the hinges themselves cannot. So I look at this, and my reaction is, what? What's he talking about here? Hinges, orientation points, etc. And I think what he's getting at is he's searching for the right word to describe this idea that he's discovered. And I don't think he quite settles on a good explanation for that. But at the same time, essentially the same time he's writing this, the same idea was emerging within software engineering. So that just sort of takes my other hat as the software person, so let me take you down there for a moment. But so David Parnas in 1972 wrote this very famous article for, at least in software circles, on the criteria to be used in decomposing systems into modules. He introduces this notion of information hiding, which essentially separates the interface from the implementation. So he writes in there, we propose instead that one begins with a list of difficult design decisions or design decisions which are likely to change. Each module is then designed to hide such a decision from others. So we can already see this concept similar to what Lachmann was talking about, where things change at different rates. So what is this notion of information hiding? So economists talk about the dangers of hidden information, but product programmers talk about the virtues of information hiding. It's by hiding the details that are likely to change more frequently behind an interface that is relatively stable, you can build more robust systems, robust to change. So the interface is the what that separates the why and the how, and I'll get more into that later. So to try to make this a little more clear, I'm going to use Lachmann's example of posting a letter. This is from Lachmann. We know very well that the post office works according to a general plan, but such knowledge as we have about it is usually quite irrelevant to the achievement of our purpose of posting a letter. The existence of such institutions is fundamental to civilized society. They enable each of us to rely on the actions of thousands of anonymous others about whose individual purposes and plans we could know nothing. So here's a sort of schematic thing where here I call it an abstraction boundary, but it's an interface where you have the postal customer, the customer on one side who wants to mail a letter, and you have a post office that then needs to implement that action of mailing a letter. And the interface sits between the two in terms of what needs to happen. So the customer has a why, a purpose of what they're trying to achieve. The post office has a how and how they implement it. And this interface is where they meet and says what that needs to be accomplished. So I'm going to try to walk you through what I see going from a specific to an abstract relationship. So let's imagine that Alice wants to send a birthday card to her mother. And Bob specializes in delivering birthday cards from Alice to her mom. So Alice and Bob's plans coordinate. The problem here is, of course, this is a very brittle relationship. Plan coordination only occurs in very specific circumstances. A slight variation on any of their party's parts, the plans fail. So if Alice wants to send a birthday card to her sister, she's out of luck. If Bob only delivers birthday cards to Lucy's mother, she's out of luck. So you can sort of generalize this in two directions. And the first one then in the computer science literature is called polymorphic. But you can imagine all of a sudden Carol comes along and she realizes she too can specialize in delivering birthday cards from Alice to her mother. But unlike Bob, who drives his car, she rides a bike. Soon someone else such as Ted can join as well. So now we have this polymorphic relationship. That should be Alice. Alice still wants to send her mom a birthday card, but now there are multiple providers, all specialized in delivering birthday cards from Alice to her mom. But now she has from Alice's perspective, she has more chances of her plan succeeding because she now has multiple providers who can do that. But we also have what in software we call reuse. So Carol, remember, who has joined Bob as specializing in delivering Alice's birthday cards to her mother, recognizes that Alice may want to send other messages besides birthday cards. She may want to send messages to other people than her mother, and other people may want to send messages besides Alice. So now an abstraction has occurred. We have gone from Alice, birthday card, Alice, mother, has now become sender, letter, address. So Carol can now fulfill a diversity of whys, not just Alice, to specific need, and now we have multiple providers as well. So this notion of an abstract relation is what happens when you combine both polymorphism and abstract relationship. So the abstraction boundary works both ways. It reduces the knowledge that clients need to know about the details of the provider's plans and the knowledge the provider needs about the details of their clients. here's sort of a schematic version of this. So in this specific relationship, we have Alice as a client and Bob as a provider. We see in a reuse relationship, we can have multiple people with different purposes that somebody can fulfill their plans for. In polymorphic thing, we have multiple people who can provide the house, implement the plans. And in an abstract relation, we now have on both sides this abstraction occurring. So I have an earlier paper I wrote with a colleague of mine, Mark Miller, and that we called it institutions as abstraction boundaries, but here I want to refer to it as abstract relations. And in that we say that this idea of interfaces and information hiding actually bundles several related concepts, which I won't have time to go on here, but you have information hiding, interface, encapsulation, and this notion of type. Because this interface distinguishes this type of thing from all other things. It identifies instances of the type, and these instances may differ on other dimensions. And I won't have time to go into it now. I think this last point is key. So now on each side of the abstraction boundary, while there's a point of agreement where plans are coordinated, there's also diversity on each side. There's diversity of purposes, and there's diversity of how people go about implementing. And it's this diversity on each side of the abstraction boundary which actually allows the adaptation to be unknown. I just want to call out this paper by Peter Alain and McGlade. Peter Alain studied with Ilya Prigogine. This is evolutionary drive and the effect of microscopic diversity. And it's this notion of microscopic diversity, the heterogeneity that's behind these abstraction boundaries, that as things change, allow sort of new boundaries to emerge. So, what I go on here is sort of basically say that Lachmann and Hayek are complements. So Lachmann's notion of institutional order talks about fundamental institutions, which is very similar to Hayek's abstract rules. Lachmann's secondary institutions become these abstract relationships. Lachmann recognizes the abstraction aspect of information hiding, and where Hayek emphasizes encapsulation. And Lachmann sort of building up from the individual plan, and Hayek sort of descending from the overall order, but they meet at this notion of abstract relations. So that's the end of my talk. And one second, there's this other article of Carl's, I believe it's the delicate nature of markets, where he talks about how he was scolded by Lachmann for presenting new ideas at a conference that nobody would understand. And so I perhaps have emulated Carl here, but we'll find out.
Thank you very much for the perfect timing. Questions from the floor? Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Can you repeat your name?
Melissa Vergara.
Melissa. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. So I'm wondering, in this framework, I mean, there's a sense in which institutions, regardless of whether they're good or bad, are. I mean, if you think of institutions, I picked up, this idea, or you shared that existence of institutions is the sign of a civilized society. But of course, we have qualities of institutions, right? So, what would be the thing in this framework that distinguishes a good institution from a bad institution? Or if there's space in this for that? I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. I think in the sort of the Hayekian framework and what Lachmann's building on in that is this notion of plan coordination. So I don't think there's any moral judgment of good versus bad here, but it's good to the extent that it enables plans to coordinate and more plans to coordinate. Now certainly there could be plans that aren't good, and so that might lead to a bad what you might consider a bad institution, but I don't think that's what they're getting at here. What they're really looking at is what's the success people's able to cooperate with each other.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, I'm just thinking. So the examples that you gave of, posting a letter and so forth. So, if you post a letter in Colombia, it's very unlikely that it will get to its destination, right? So, but still, you can trust in the post office, or at least it works. It has this institutional role because people still go to the post office and hope for the best. So this is.
Yeah, so I think in this model, the abstraction boundary would allow somebody else to use the same abstraction boundary of abstract relationship of posting a letter to provide a better service. And perhaps it's not possible, post office is perhaps a bad example because it's usually monopoly run, but you can look at Federal Express that basically uses the same boundary, but then said we can take packages. They did do letters because, again, that was sort of a monopoly of the U.S. Postal Service. But they ended up by redefining the how of delivering letters. So we now can, and by doing that, by having a hub and spoke airline system, we can now, not just deliver your package, but we can deliver it next day. So it's this abstraction boundary that allows for new implementations of this, sort of common feature of mailing a letter or a package to, evolve over time.
Yeah, could you just put up the slide where you had a citation from Jackie McClade there?
Oh, is that?
Just for me to copy it.
Oh, sure.
McClade is a very interesting person.
Okay, I'm more familiar with Peter, but I wasn't. But
Jackie McClade was the head of the European Environment, whatever it's called, authority. She married a Maasai tribesman who lives in a Maasai hut somewhere. But anyway, no, just wondering. But I have my question for you is really about the posting a letter. Then you said, well, here's a modern version. Well, the interesting thing about the letter situation is that never seemed to sort of expand to other providers. In Rome, at one point, we did have a sort of parallel service of post with different boxes. Yeah. And I once sent 2 or 3 letters through that, and they never got there. I don't know what happened to that. But with the other things, SMS and so forth, there you really have a nice example of alternatives and so forth. So I think we should stick to the modern example.
Yeah, well, I was borrowing it from Lachmann, but as I said, I think it's a little bit unfortunate because the post office tends to be a monopoly provider, so it doesn't illustrate the diversity that I want to capture here.
Anyway, thank you very much.
I'm also hands up. Okay, Niels first.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, so much for your talk. So I think it's really a fascinating idea to understand institution as an interface. So I think that's really a helpful thought. So I have to think more about it, but in your opinion, so how does that fit to the common differentiation in institutional economics between formal and informal institution? In a way, an interface looks for me like an informal institution because the user does not understand why he follows a specific rule in a way. On the other hand, an interface is a sort of a formal rule because you need an expert who makes something explicit so that it will be work. So like a law or something like that. So is it something in between or catches up everything? So yeah.
Yeah, so Lachmann actually in Legacy of Max Day, they were talking about this being in the interstices, so the in-between, that this lies between the formal and sort of what he calls fundamental and secondary, but it's very similar to this formal and informal institutions. I think what's important is that this interface can emerge in different ways, but it needs to be articulate, right? It needs to be understood across the boundaries, at least the what, right? What differs is sort of the purposes behind the what the people are trying to accomplish from one side, and then how people on the other side are doing the what, the how. But there has to be this common understanding in sort of the middle, the in-between. And it's this, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from the provider, right? You can think of it perhaps as the post office is the one who comes up with the abstraction. But it, could come from the other side, right? The people, and it's really, much more of a dialogic process, I think, that these emerge over time. And people then see successful ones and want to copy it because they can fit in with, and know that people's plans will be coordinated because they're following the same interface.
Yeah, you are.
Duncan.
Duncan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so you divide up there, there's a division between more and less fundamental institutions. So your example of a post office, I would guess, would be an example more of a sort of secondary type institution. So, given Hayek's work and his emphasis on markets and the price system as a means of disseminating information in a very succinct form, and it sort of fits your idea, that idea of millions of consumers and producers and so on. They don't know why prices are what they are, but they just respond to them accordingly. So it's a very efficient system. So would you say markets are basically your overarching, most fundamental institution in a capitalist economy, or would something like private property rights be the more fundamental institution and which provide the framework within which markets can operate? And so that therefore markets are less fundamental than, say, property rights. So I'm just trying to understand this distinction between fundamental and secondary.
Yeah, so I think, so I'm borrowing this from Lachmann, this concept of fundamental and secondary institutions. But for fundamental institutions, for Lachmann are very much the latter. They're things like property rights and contract and sort of the legal institutions and framework that allows these sort of secondary institutions to emerge. And I think these secondary institutions are an interesting, maybe a third visible, invisible hand we have here now. They're sort of in between the sort of the legal foundation and the these emergent institutions that are actually trying to solve people's day-to-day problems, right? So the legal institutions are very abstract in their, but they need to be applied and made more concrete, and they're ironically made concrete through these abstract relations. And to your question of how sort of prices come in here, I think it's a very interesting question, and this is probably a whole nother topic of which, but Hayek in his last work, The Fatal Conceit, talks about prices as a further superimposition of a further classification. And I don't have time to even begin to talk about what that means if I even know what it means, but I think you can actually see this as sort of a third level. So you can think of there's fundamental institutions, there's these secondary institutions, which are actually their interrelationships between people trying to coordinate their plans, and then prices come on top, where that gives us some sense of what other people's plans, who are not involved in this immediate transactions, but nonetheless it impacts us through the price system. Our individual relationship now, how we use resources and compared to what other people need to use these resources can feed in through the price system. So the way I think of it, there's almost 3 levels now.
Thank you. Other questions at tea break? Thank you very much, Bill. Now we have Andreas. Huh?
Do you mind if I sit here?
I don't mind.
Could take my seat.
I'll see.
Okay.
Can't see.
The thing was blocking the screen.
Oh, yeah. That was it.
Where's he going to sit?
I'm going to sit here.
That's
Go
why
sit there. Oh, okay.
chair.
No, so I moved.
Thank you very much.
I moved there to see the screen too.
Sei italiano? Nessuno è perfetto.
Nessuno è perfetto.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you. So we have Andreas Freytag from Freytag University. Andreas is very interested in public choice, political economy, economic analysis of politics, and he's going to tell us going to present a paper about between social philosophy and technical execution. Economists and politics. Thank you. What is yours?
Thank you for a nice introduction. First, I want to thank the organizers, and particularly Isabella, for unprecedented generosity and hospitality in the last couple of days. I enjoyed the stay here very much. I also want to thank Michael and his team. I think it's a very entrepreneurial invitation, because I do not work almost close to what in the depth you work on the say philosophical foundations of economics. Well, my work is rather simple. I will tell you a bit about my projects I've done recently, but I can tell you that I've been educated in the tradition of the ordo-liberal school. And you will, I think Niels will speak about this a bit. And the hometown is the place I now teach is the hometown of Walter Eucken. So there's a certain relation to that. But I also studied a lot about the ordo approach when I was in Kiel, but I also was raised as in working on international trade. So topics I'm dealing with, for instance, just to give you a flavor, I did a few papers on the questions of plurilaterals, of whether plurilaterals would be a tool to escape the stalemate of the WTO. So based on the theory of clubs. We did work on Chinese aid. Does it change the attitude of Latin American citizens towards democracy? The good news, it increases the appetite for democracy. So that's very good news. And stuff like that. And as Jean-Paul has said, I'm very interested in economic policy, and I have the chair of economic policy, and I was always with the chair of economic policy. As a student, as an assistant, there was always the main focus on that. And we often discuss the topic of policy advice. How do we do good policy advice? And since there's a quite current German debate on policy advice, it's been ongoing for a couple of years, but it culminated lately in the appointment of 2 new members in the so-called German Council of Economic Advisors. In German, it's der Sachverständigenrat. Sachverständig means expertise, full of expertise. This council has 2 new members, and this I pick up from here. That's the part, because the debate around is quite interesting. And it catches up quite of what has been discussed here. And I can tell you up front that in this new world, we probably would not be really seen as experts. But let's speak about that. So first, I would like to make a few comments on why do we demand policy advice? What is the purpose of policy advice? Why do politicians need advice? And the first is, do they need better knowledge? I heavily doubt that, because the ministries are full of very well-trained economists and lawyers, so there's no need for my expertise. So the guys in Geneva know much more about trade policy than the professor of trade. So they really know everything. So why would they ask for it? Number second would be, we control the government. So by publishing papers in regular media, by writing expertises for say certain interest groups or for ministries, we indirectly control the government. And we inform the public about alternatives. That's something which is important. So the Council of Economic Advisors publishes a report every year. And then in between, sometimes they also publish reports. And these reports used to be subject to an intense public discussion. In the times of social media, these discussions end very quickly, but when I was a doctoral student, there would be at last 1 week of articles about this report. The general secretary of the council would write, and every member would write, and then there was a discussion. And this brings to the distinction between policy advice and advice of politicians. So I don't speak about meeting a politician in the back room and writing down a few elaborate, for instance, something not like that. So what I mean is publicly available expertise transported through economists, in my case, I speak about economic advice. And of course, one important issue is it reverses the burden of proof. We have a lot of regulations going on which is protecting the regulated industry, Stickler and all the like. And if you speak to them, they say, well, it helps everyone and you must prove that it doesn't help everyone. And good policy advice reverses the burden of proof. All of a sudden, this interest group has to prove that the regulation in their favor is good for us. And I can tell you a few examples later, if you wish.
Andreas, is that reserving or reversing?
Reversing. Oh, it's a typo. That's quite an important typo. So please, I'm tempted to correct it immediately. It's reversing. It's worthy, and I blame it to my program, of course. And then there's the question of what range of proposals shall policy advisors cover. So we have this discussion with a mutual friend in peace in Germany, and the relevance of the status quo. So shall we only look at those options that are politically feasible, or shall we look at all sorts of options? So shall I, as a trade guy, advocate free trade, or shall I just look into the possible options that are currently available? My take is we are not elected politicians. We are not supposed to leave out options which we think are politically unfeasible, because we cannot know what is politically feasible. This can only be known in the future. Yeah? So this is the background against which I would like to discuss policy advice, and also use this new debate in Germany, which is going on for a long time, and particularly some colleagues of German origin teaching in the US are participating in that. And it is quite well reflected in this German Council of Economic Advisors. There was about a half a year period where the 5 members went down to 3. And one member, Niels, former boss and a good friend of us, his term was not prolonged because he was too ordo-liberal. So the government doesn't want an ordo-liberal advising them. So, but they couldn't agree on whom they shall ask. The second member resigned. I don't know exactly why. Maybe Niels knows more about it. It was also, I would also regard it as an ordo-liberal. So there was all by a sudden a shortage of liberals. And the government then finally managed to appoint 2 new members, and they are both highly regarded. I think they are excellent economists. But there's a statement which makes me shiver. And this is the answer of one of the 2, female colleague from California. She said she would accept the offer because it now shows that excellent research is now the basis for policy advice in Germany. Finally. And so that leads me back to the topic. It has been interested me for decades. And it also leads me to a remark of my doctoral advisor, Jürgen Thomas. He always distinguished between elegance and relevance. For him, relevance was more important than elegance. When it comes to modeling particularly. So, and I would like to develop my talk along 4 questions. First question is, what is excellent research? And has policy advice always been done by lousy economists before? Let's discuss this. Then the next question, of course, is, does excellent research really lead to excellent policy advice? So is it really so that if you're a wonderful researcher published in the best journals that you also are the best policy advisor? And then, is there an ideal model for policy advice? I have put some thoughts into that, so some pure economic reasoning, how we should organize policy advice. And then, of course, the question of normative elements. Shall we have a paradigm, or is a paradigm important to do policy advice? And if so, how do we deal with that? What can we do to display it so that everybody knows what is our background? So these are the 4 questions I find relevant in this context. Come to the first question. What is excellent research. So first, it's based on rankings. Yeah? So we have these rankings for journals. We discussed this over several meals here, the different incentive structures that are generated by these rankings. And of course, these rankings follow fashions. For instance, I have published a paper in telecommunication policy in 1997. That was a quite obscure journal then. This paper has made its way. It's in the reference series of ELGA, and now this journal is quite important. So all of a sudden, I was moving up the rankings because I published a paper 25 years back, which is now counting as important. But then it wasn't. So my incentive was I couldn't foresee that 25 years later, this paper is in a good journal when I published that in this mediocre journal then. And Auto, the journalist, which is co-edited by Niels, was very important in the 1980s and has fallen now because it's no longer...
Not of my fault.
What did you say?
Not of my fault.
No, I think that this little upward trend is now reflected by your presence. I still like to publish that, so I just sent a paper to so it is. So what I want to say, there are fashions and there's things are changed, and of course there's also cartelization. And I would like to give an example here, which I heard from others repeated. A student of mine went then to Harvard to his PhD. He worked on trust. He works with colleagues in Stellenbosch. He has a wonderful paper on trust, and I looked through the reference list and said to him, why don't you cite my friends from Scandinavia who have invested a lot of work into trust? It is forbidden. It is not Ivy League. It is public choice. We are not allowed to cite a paper from public choice. So bad science, I would say. That is what I mean by cartelization. And I heard several of these examples. They're just an example. But it makes me also a bit uneasy. So the rankings are at least dubious. Yeah? Then, of course, the methods. So in these days, you presented this, Melissa, very clearly. There's a methodological change, and we have much better methods these days with respect to the empirical work. So, and if you're good in methods, you can publish well, and so that's probably important. But of course, it depends on the problem at hand. Not every problem needs a fancy model. So that's, and then again, the relevance question: is this research relevant? Difficult for me, it's difficult to judge this because it may become relevant in the future. So that you may create a wonderful model of a theory which nobody finds relevant, but later, 20 years later, your problem is relevant, and then somebody looks into the archives, finds your paper and thinks, wonderful paper, it explains the problem very well. So I think this contestability of markets, I think that is an example for that. By the way, it has been already written by Machlub in '57, so that's not new, it's only formalized. And then political economy. Yeah, we spoke about macroeconomic engineering. I don't know where it was on your. Somewhere I found macroeconomic engineering. I think in Alain's your slide. Yeah, this phrase is crazy. I think engineering is not the right phrase for economic policy making. That's not. And you made the point also. And then James Quandy gave a talk at the Public Choice Conference in 2014, and he shows that all 101 textbooks don't mention government failure at all. Yeah, so in a few textbooks there's a couple of mentioning, but the idea that governments are not always benevolent is not incorporated into the first-year students' minds, which leads an Austrian economist, sociologist, writer to the notion neoclassical economists are socialists. They believe in the state. Comes to the rescue every time there's a problem. We know that's not the case. So we must be more modest. And of course the question is, would Karl Niedermeyer be regarded as excellent today against the background of what this colleague just claimed the other day? So I think it's a nonsensical theory. We just shouldn't follow that anymore. It doesn't help us much. And this is reinforced by the answer to my second question. Does excellent research guarantee excellent policy advice? Yes, it can. I think we all have examples of people, scholars who are wonderful theorists or excellent empiricists and also very good policy advisors, have a very good political economy feeling. Yeah, in my mind, I think of Hans-Werner Sinn or Herbert Giersch, German colleagues. Yeah, but there's also those who are not very good. And this is a question of which model do we believe? And I call it the Vernon model versus the Ricardo Weiner model. The Vernon model means over time comparative advantages change. So you start your career as a theorist, an eager theorist, you write the theoretical papers, and the older you get, the better is your political economy understanding. And at the end of your career, you are the perfect policy advisor. That's the one way to do it. The other way is the Ricardo Weiner model, means there is specialization, or to some people are very good theorists, others can apply